It all started during a live-streamed panel discussion at Columbia University, where the topic was culture, class, and the American identity. The guests were high-profile, Senator J.D. Vance, actor and philanthropist Denzel Washington, and Professor Elliot Ramsey, a respected historian and civil rights scholar. The moderator barely finished her introduction before J.D. Vance leaned into his mic. "I appreciate Mr. Washington's talent in film," he said with a practiced smile. "But when it comes to real American values, hard work, discipline, personal responsibility, Hollywood elites often miss the mark." The room tensed. Cameras zoomed in. Denzel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Vance continued, doubling down. "We can't let people who live in gated mansions tell working Americans how to raise their kids or run their towns." A few chuckles rippled through the conservative-leaning audience section. But most eyes drifted toward Professor Ramsey, who sat between them, quietly listening. Denzel leaned forward calmly. "I don't recall speaking for America. But if my life story, growing up in Mount Vernon, raised by a Pentecostal minister and a beauty salon owner, qualifies me as elite, then I'd love to know what hardship looks like in your book." There was a pause. J.D. opened his mouth to reply, but Professor Ramsey raised his hand. "Before we devolve into finger-pointing," the professor said, "I think some historical context might be useful." The room hushed. Everyone knew when Ramsey spoke, it mattered. Professor Ramsey adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly toward his microphone, his voice calm but resonant. "Senator Vance," he began, "you spoke of discipline and personal responsibility. Admirable values, certainly. But let's not pretend they're exclusive to your background, or your politics." J.D. Vance folded his arms, trying to mask the unease in his posture. "Mr. Washington," the professor continued, turning with respect, "has demonstrated those very values, perhaps more visibly than most public servants. His life is a case study in the American dream, albeit one forged under a different kind of pressure." Denzel nodded, remaining silent. Professor Ramsey turned back to J.D. "The issue here isn't discipline, it's selective storytelling. You speak as though the struggles of Appalachia give you moral authority, while Mr. Washington's journey somehow disqualifies him." The audience shifted in their seats. A few murmured in agreement. "Senator," Ramsey continued, "do you know the first time Denzel Washington donated $1 million to a historically black college? 1993, quietly. No press release. Do you know how many scholarships that created? Hundreds." J.D. Vance's lips parted slightly, as if to counter, but Ramsey wasn't finished. "You accuse him of being an elite, yet you've sat in Ivy League classrooms, worked for hedge funds, and now serve in the Senate. Are you saying you speak more for the working class than a man who's built homes, paid tuition, and mentored hundreds without ever needing to brag about it?" The room went still. All eyes were now fixed on Vance. He glanced toward the moderator, clearly eager to pivot. But Professor Ramsey raised a final point. "Respect isn't about where you come from, it's about how you carry others once you rise." J.D. Vance cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "I think we're missing the point," he said, his voice sharper now. "This isn't about charity or fame, it's about influence. When actors start preaching politics, especially to working Americans, it's fair to question their authority." Denzel finally leaned in, not angry, just focused. "I never claimed to be a politician," he said evenly. "But I am an American. And I've lived long enough to know that when people like me speak up, we're told to stay in our lane. But when someone else stands on a stage and lectures coal miners or single mothers on values, it's considered leadership." A ripple of applause broke out from the audience. Denzel continued, "I've walked through prisons, funded community centers, and stood in neighborhoods where the system forgot folks completely. I don't need a podium to know what people go through. I've been there. Have you, Senator?" The question hung in the air. Vance's smile faltered. He shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable now. The moderator tried to interject, but Professor Ramsey held up a hand once more, commanding the moment. "We talk about lanes," the professor said. "But Mr. Washington's so-called lane has done more for marginalized Americans than 1,000 think tanks and Senate hearings." He paused, then looked directly at Vance. "And when a man like Denzel speaks, he doesn't speak down. He speaks across. That's what real leadership looks like." The room erupted, cheers, claps, even some standing ovations from students near the back. J.D. Vance looked stunned. For once, the senator had no words. As the applause finally settled, the moderator leaned forward, visibly rattled. "Well," she said, trying to regain control of the room, "that was certainly a powerful exchange. Senator Vance, would you like to respond?" J.D. Vance adjusted his tie and forced a half-smile, but his voice lacked the earlier edge. "I think this has become more emotional than factual," he muttered. "I'm not here to debate biographies, I'm here to talk policy. And my concern is with the cultural narrative being pushed by celebrity figures," but he was cut off, not by Denzel, not by the professor, by a student. A young black woman stood up in the middle of the auditorium, her hand raised high. The moderator hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." The student didn't waver. "With all due respect, Senator, what cultural narrative are you referring to? Because I grew up on Denzel Washington movies that showed black excellence, accountability, sacrifice, and pride. That is culture. And I never once heard him speak to divide Americans, only to uplift." A few more students clapped softly. J.D. tried to speak, but she kept going. "You say actors should stay out of politics, but you don't mind when athletes, businessmen, or even reality TV stars speak on political issues, do you? It's only a problem when their message doesn't align with yours." Vance leaned back, caught off guard. The professor didn't speak this time. He just looked at Denzel, who gave a small nod of gratitude to the student. Denzel turned back to the room. "I'm not running for office," he said quietly. "I don't want power. I want progress." That line landed like a thunderclap. And J.D. Vance? He sat in silence, his political calculation visibly scrambling behind his eyes, but it was too late. The debate was over. The event wrapped not long after. Cameras were still rolling, but the tone had shifted. J.D. Vance remained quiet through the closing remarks, nodding politely but saying little. Denzel Washington left the stage without fanfare, no victory lap, no smugness, just a calm walk out the side exit with Professor Ramsey beside him. Backstage, a few reporters huddled near the green room, whispering about what had just unfolded. One of them turned to Professor Ramsey. "Did you plan that?" Ramsey gave a tired smile. "Truth doesn't need choreography. It just needs a microphone." The student who had spoken up earlier managed to catch Denzel in the hallway. "Thank you," she said simply. He paused, looked her in the eye. "No," he replied, "thank you for standing up when it counted. Keep doing that." Meanwhile, online, clips of the debate were already going viral. J.D. Vance silenced by Professor and Denzel in epic takedown, students' question leaves Vance speechless, Denzel proves class has nothing to do with politics, commentators on both sides weighed in, but the consensus was clear, Vance had underestimated the weight of lived experience. By the next morning, even political analysts on neutral platforms were echoing the same point: you can challenge a man's ideas, but when you try to erase his journey, you better come armed with more than talking points. And as one editorial put it bluntly, Vance went after Denzel. But in the end, it was the classroom, not the Senate floor, that schooled him. What happened at Columbia didn't stay at Columbia. The exchange dominated headlines for the rest of the week. Political pundits tried to spin it every which way, some called it a missed opportunity for Vance, others said it revealed a deeper divide between cultural influence and political gatekeeping. But the real story wasn't what was said on stage. It was what happened afterward. Clips of Denzel's comments were played in barbershops, classrooms, church basements, and on social media loops across the country. His message, about leadership, humility, and service without seeking credit, hit a nerve in places politicians often forgot. At a town hall in Youngstown, Ohio, Vance faced a question from a local teacher. "Senator, after what happened at Columbia, do you think maybe we should listen more to those outside the Capitol, and less to ourselves?" He stumbled through a deflection, but the tone had changed. Meanwhile, Professor Ramsey's inbox overflowed with speaking requests. Universities, civic groups, even some moderate think tanks wanted him to elaborate on what he called narrative gatekeeping, how only certain stories are deemed valid in American politics. But perhaps the most unexpected impact came from students. Applications to Ramsey's class doubled. A new scholarship fund, anonymously named after the debate that ended the debate, was launched to support first-gen college students who defy cultural stereotypes. As for Denzel, he never posted about it. Never gave a follow-up interview. But quietly, he doubled his donation to community mentorship programs. Because for him, it was never about the moment. It was always about the mission. Months later, the debate was still referenced in podcasts, op-eds, and college seminars. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore, it had become a case study. Professors across disciplines began using the Columbia Exchange as material for coursework on leadership, narrative bias, and civic discourse. One syllabus simply titled the unit, "The Night the Room Chose Wisdom Over Power." Senator J.D. Vance remained politically active, but he struggled to escape the shadow of that night. Every time he took the stage to lecture on real American values, someone in the audience inevitably brought up what happened with Denzel Washington. A common joke began circulating in political circles: if you're debating culture, don't bring a knife to a Denzel conversation. Meanwhile, Professor Ramsey published a short essay in The Atlantic titled, "When Story Outranks Status." It went viral for a second time. He wrote, "The night wasn't about a senator losing a debate. It was about what happens when we stop measuring worth by titles and start listening to lived truth." But the most meaningful aftermath happened far from the cameras. At a youth center in Newark, a teen recited one of Denzel's lines during a public speaking workshop: "I don't want power. I want progress." The room went quiet. Then, applause. It was proof that the message had taken root, not because it was shouted, but because it was earned. And so, what began as a clash of egos in an ivy-covered auditorium quietly grew into something bigger, a reminder that voices without office can still carry the most weight, and sometimes, the closing argument comes from the people, not the podium. In the months that followed, the Columbia Exchange faded from headlines, but its impact continued like an underground current, quietly reshaping how conversations unfolded in spaces that rarely intersect: policy rooms, film schools, black churches, conservative town halls. Young organizers across the country began referencing the moment not just for what Denzel said, but how he said it. Calm. Direct. Unapologetically rooted in truth. It became a model for a new kind of civic dialogue, one where credentials didn't overpower character, and where silence, when wielded right, said more than a mic drop. Even inside Washington, a few staffers admitted anonymously that the Vance Washington moment forced some senators to reconsider their public tone, especially when speaking about communities they didn't represent. Meanwhile, Denzel's public presence remained low-key. No memoirs. No interviews about the debate. But his foundation quietly launched a fellowship for young leaders working in underserved areas: no cameras, no speeches. Just action. Professor Ramsey was invited to deliver the 2026 commencement address at Howard University. He ended it with a single line that echoed across social media that week: "You don't need to raise your voice when your life is already the loudest thing in the room." That quote appeared days later, graffitied on a wall in South Chicago. Etched into the footer of an op-ed in Teen Vogue. Printed on the back of a protest sign in Memphis. And in J.D. Vance's office, a young intern reportedly taped it to a corkboard: no attribution, no context. Just the words. Because even those in power knew, some debates end on stage. But others never stop echoing. What no one expected was how far the moment would travel beyond U.S. borders. Clips of the debate were translated into multiple languages, Spanish, French, even Swahili, and shared across international media platforms as an example of grace under fire. In South Africa, a university professor used the footage in a lecture titled "Dignity in Disagreement." In London, a youth leadership summit screened the full debate and held a workshop afterward, asking students, whose voice do we silence without realizing it? The answer, more often than not, came back to one word: experience. Denzel's quiet resolve resonated especially in places where people often feel talked about instead of talked to. His line, "I want progress, not power," became a kind of mantra, even outside political spaces. Back in the U.S., J.D. Vance's next public town hall was interrupted by a small but powerful moment. A middle-aged man in a worn work jacket stood up during Q&A and said simply, "I listened to you, Senator. But I heard Denzel." The room fell silent. No anger. No confrontation. Just clarity. Even Vance, for once, didn't respond. Because he didn't need to. Sometimes, history doesn't crown winners with a cheer. Sometimes, it leaves a scar, and a mirror. A year to the day after the Columbia Exchange, the university hosted a new panel, this time titled, "Voice, Power, and the Right to be Heard." It was packed before the doors opened. Professor Elliot Ramsey was invited back as moderator. The student who had challenged J.D. Vance that night was now a senior, and the keynote speaker. Her speech was titled simply, "When the Room Chose to Listen." Denzel Washington wasn't there. But his chair, third from the left, was left empty on purpose, with a small placard that read, "Reserved, for the one who needed no title." The gesture was quiet, powerful, and perfect. That night, the university unveiled a new scholarship in Denzel's name, not for acting, or media, or politics. For integrity. Outside, it was raining. A group of students walked together, one of them reading aloud from a printed copy of Professor Ramsey's article. They stopped under a street lamp, reflecting on the ripple one voice, rooted in humility and truth, could send through a system built on noise. And across the city, in a quiet office lit only by a desk lamp, J.D. Vance sat watching a replay of that original panel, again. This time, he didn't frown. He didn't smile, either. He just watched. Because in the end, when the applause fades and the headlines move on, what remains is the echo. And if you're wise enough, you learn from it. Behind the scenes in Washington, something subtle had changed. Senators and staffers, especially those who'd watched the full Columbia Exchange, began recalibrating. Not publicly. Not all at once. But it was there. You could hear it in how some lawmakers chose their words more carefully when speaking about poverty, race, or American values. You could feel it in the hesitation before they made sweeping generalizations about communities they didn't understand. Denzel Washington had never walked into Congress. But somehow, his presence had. In committee rooms, staffers started quietly referencing the Denzel rule, an informal shorthand meaning, if you're about to dismiss someone's story, think twice. You might be underestimating who's listening. Even Professor Ramsey, once considered too academic for mainstream influence, found himself being invited to closed-door sessions, briefings, listening panels, and strategy rooms where empathy had rarely been on the agenda. His only condition? No monologues. Just stories. And he brought them, stories from barbershops in Baltimore, classrooms in Detroit, shelters in Kansas City, and yes, from sets where actors like Denzel walked the talk without needing to post about it. Something deeper was beginning. Not a revolution. A recentering. And while no bill was passed in Denzel's name, and no Senate resolution acknowledged that night, something more enduring had taken root, a reminder that the loudest voice isn't always the truest, and that one moment of dignity, witnessed by millions, can outlast a decade of soundbites. It was a quiet afternoon when Professor Ramsey received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Just a simple note inside, "You were right." I stopped listening for a while. That night reminded me how to start again. "Thank you." J.D. Ramsey read it twice. Then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, not to save the words, but to honor the silence behind them. Elsewhere, the student who once stood up during the debate had now become a Rhodes Scholar. In her final interview, she was asked who inspired her most. She didn't hesitate. "A man who taught me that silence isn't weakness, it's restraint sharpened by truth. And a professor who taught me that speaking boldly is meaningless unless you've earned the right to be heard." That quote ended up on the wall of Columbia's Media Studies building, beneath a photo from that night, the moment Professor Ramsey raised his hand to pause the debate. No caption. Just the image. As for Denzel Washington, he never returned to comment. He didn't need to. Because what happened that night had never been about him. It was about what he represented. A quiet force of conviction. A life lived without demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore when it finally spoke. And so, the debate ended not with a mic drop or a victory pose. It ended with a truth too steady to deny, and too grounded to shout. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments in politics, are the ones where no one runs for office, but someone finally steps into their voice.